thought I might try something a little different today. This time I actually have a story to accompany this video. A creepy story. A story called Old Curios. The road that ran through the stretch of desert held no novelty for Reggie by now. It wasn't any more or less scenic than the thousands of veins that connected the arid nowhere settlements of rural Middle America. It was hours of hypnotic sameness in all the shades of muted brown. Sometimes you even got the luxury of pavement. Reginald Reggie Arsenault had been combing these roads with his dusty blue 78 Ford Bobcat in a caffeine-saturated fugue state for nearly 2 weeks, and the few leads he'd scrounged for were thin at best. Reggie's folks were never the best couple as far as he could remember. The home life was tense. The fact that his father was on the road for much of the year could have been either a help or a hindrance to the domestic harmony. Reggie figured it was a paradoxical mix of the two. There was no doubt that Walter loved his children, but it was the general consensus of everyone close enough to the family that he just managed to tolerate the relationship with his wife. This was the reason the police had been less than thorough with questioning. The lukewarm investigation lasted a day before a middle-aged cynical gumshoe came to the staunch conclusion that Walter must have been plotting an escape plan for a while. He told the frantic wife with piss-poor tact that he probably just snapped and made a break for it. Reggie's mother was grief-stricken, his kid brother was just angry, and Reggie himself was of the opinion the whole scene stunk of horse shit. He wasn't about to accept that the man he admired had abandoned his family for a life on the run. College had just wrapped up for the summer, and he had a couple $100 of cash saved up from his weekend bartending job. It took little more than 8 seconds of consideration to decide that he was going to try and track the man down. After some cursory rummaging, he found out what the stock of the hour was. His father never bothered to share much about what he was selling. Not because it was anything nefarious, it was just outrageously boring. It changed every month or so, and after a while in the biz, it stopped being brought up. Scratching around in the piles of his dad's old mail, he found out that the man was hawking kitchen supplies. Not domestic supplies, mind you, but the kind you'd see in a diner. He'd most likely be dazzling the owners and staff with the shiny lure of posh commercial culinary tools, maybe with laminated full-color photos if he was on his game. Then he would delicately tease a check or credit card from the mark and be off like St. Nick into the next rotary. After tracking down some business associates, Reggie managed to triangulate a rough beat where the man was supposed to be knocking on doors. He had told his mom he was going on a trip with some friends, that he needed to get his head straight. He felt like trash for lying to his mom when she was in that place, not knowing whether to grieve or curse the name of Walter Arsenault. He felt even worse for leaving. He didn't have a great search scheme, but figured that a zigzag pattern across the state was the best start. He'd stop in at every greasy spoon and roadhouse until someone remembered traveling kitchen supplies salesman. It was a brute force approach, slow, tedious, but the only real option he had. To his credit, it turned up a few small leads, a couple very decent leads, and a resounding affirmation when he wandered into a diner on the corner of a cracked road that was somehow deemed a highway, an honorary title, he surmised. It was a wonder the place this isolated could even stay afloat. The sun-baked matron behind the counter had squinted ponderously when Reggie showed her the photograph of his old man. "Ah, you mean, what's his name? Walter," a voice from behind her called out. The cook had leaned over the counter that separated the till from the kitchen. He'd overheard the conversation between Reggie and the waitress, who had, until then, been about to deny any knowledge of the man. "Yeah, nice fella. Real gentleman. Good at his job. Faye was working the register that day, Gina. You were at your sister's thing." Reggie held back his excitement. This was the first irrefutable clue. "Do you remember whenabouts this was?" Reggie asked eagerly. "Did he seem off? Do you know which way he went when he left?" The anticipation of finding clues to his father's whereabouts had set him on edge, and the eagerness had begun to cascade. "Whoa, hold up there, son," the cook chuckled as he wiped his hands off and walked around into the restaurant. "What's this all about?" His voice took on a softer, concerned tone. "Hey, your pa? He's missing, I take it." Reggie was stunned for a moment. The cook held his hand out in a calm down sort of way. "You look just like him is all, and you look like you've been on the road for a hot damn minute. Gina, pull this kid a cup of joe. Son, I'll grab you a BLT. Reggie was about to object, but the cook cut him off. "It's on the house." Reggie sat down in a booth by the window and stared out at the scorched and dust-muted scrub brush. Before too long, the cook sat down across from him and shoved a sandwich and fries across the table. "Thank you," he said, humbled and feeling a tad choked up at the random generosity. He tried not to show how ravenous he was, but the BLT was gone inside of 3 minutes, the fries in 2. So, I'm sorry to hear about your pa. I sincerely hope you find him. Don't know how much help I can be. I'm Wayne. Reggie. He shook the older man's hand. How long has he been missing? About a month. Can't say for sure. He didn't call home for a while and we started to wonder. It wasn't until he didn't show up that we got nervous. Cops say he ran off to get away from us. But he wouldn't do that. He and Ma weren't great together, but he was a decent man. Wayne leaned in and sighed sympathetically. Son, I'm hearing you. But the truth is, sometimes folks just keep all that strain under wraps. And then one day, he wouldn't do that. Reggie had a tone of finality in his voice, as he looked assertively at Wayne, who nodded resignedly. All right, if you say he wouldn't do it, I have to trust you. In all truth, he didn't seem strange or off when he rolled through here, but son, the alternative ain't too pretty neither. Reggie swallowed the lump in his throat. The two were silent for a moment. When an old relic of a man shuffled through the door and sat down at the counter, Wayne got up from the table, leaning over and giving Reggie a clap on the shoulder. That'll be $23. A cheeky smile just below the surface. Fucking with you, champ. Get out of here. And kid, I hope for you and your family's sake that those detectives were right. It hurts, I know, but you can sometimes fix gone. You can't fix dead. There was no mockery in the remark. He said it with genuine compassion. Reggie went to leave, but turned around. Any chance you remember which way he went? Wayne pondered the question for a moment and turned to his newest patron. You remember that salesman the other day, Joe? The old man at the counter nodded. Oh, yeah. Took off down Bull Creek Road. Said something about cutting through. Anyhow, I didn't like him. Kind of sleazy. It was Gina's turn to pipe up from the other end of the diner. Christ, Joe, that's his boy. Joe coughed sheepishly. Oh, sorry, kid. Really? Driving a fancy car like that around here? Reggie was already looking out the door at the street signs. Thanks for the tip. Thanks again for the sandwich, he yelled back as he shouldered his way out to meet the hot wind of the midday desert. Watch out for snakes, said Wayne, but the boy was already yarding at the car door. There wasn't a whole lot on this strip. The road never crested high enough to see past the low foothills. It wound lazily above a dried creek bed for what seemed like 4 hours, but was maybe only 2. He spotted something man-made take shape off in the distance. Civilization? Gas station? Oh, but please be a diner. He slowed as he passed the solitary, dilapidated structure. It had an old 7-Up sign hanging on by one hard-working chain. The windows were dusty, but Reggie could see shelves of assorted odds. The sign over the door was hand-painted in some pseudo-elegant font. He guessed it was meant to give the impression of prestige once upon a decade past, but the desert wind and sun had thinned the paint, drawing out the marks of the brush that made it. It read, Old Curios. He had to admit that it had a kind of kitsch allure. Being way out here in the foothills of absolute desolation, it seemed to be making a stubborn statement directed at only a few who found it. Drive by or come in, but see me. You think I need your business to survive? Never you mind all that, traveler. As you can see, I'm very much alive. Reggie had barely considered stopping. A place like that didn't fit the criteria for a salesman of repute, but the mystery of it was enticing all the same. He continued down the road, and eventually the nothingness gave yield to civilization. It was a gas station, a hardware store, a corner market, and at least 3 places that Reggie figured any peddler worth of shiny shit would work the moves on. Frustration mounted, however, when not a single employee in any of the establishments could recall a salesman passing through. The one motel was no help either. Reggie sat, crestfallen, in his car in ponderation. Then a thought landed. It wasn't the greatest thought he'd ever had, but it had bones. He was sure his father wouldn't have passed up this mark on the way through here, which meant he probably never came through here, which meant that he must have taken a side road off between here and the diner. Reggie was willing to accept that even though he didn't remember seeing any offshoots, the white line trance had him pretty bad, and a cheeky side road could have easily snuck past undetected. There were still a few hours of daylight left, and despite the lead feeling like a presumptuous snowball of ifs and musts, it was still something. He topped off the tank and headed back the way he'd come. Reggie had begun to suspect that he hadn't noted any turnoffs for the miserable fact that they simply didn't exist. He had made it back all the way to that dry corpse of a building he had seen on the way south, the old curios standing in defiance of its own dereliction. He stopped the car. He hadn't planned on snooping around the place. He just figured this was a prime spot to drain the old valve. He stood at the edge of the partly overgrown pullout that would have been the parking area once upon a time and begun to nobly do his part in bringing water back to the desperately dry flora. While he squeezed the last of the coolant from the line, he noticed that the place had an old junkyard out back. It was mostly concealed by corrugated sheet metal fencing, but through the cracks and odd holes that had rusted out, there was a glimpse of buses, old cars. It was interesting, he couldn't deny, a ghost town of one. The plastic sign hanging inside the front door was the kind you could find in any shop window between Seattle and Palm Springs. That little adjustable clock face with the hands you can set to show when you'll be back. It was flipped around to read closed, though Reggie had guessed it hadn't been flipped in, what had Wayne said, a hot damn minute. The red hands, now a dull pink, hung impotently at 6:30. Reggie cupped his hands in the window and peered into what looked like the treasure trove of some mad king. Things upon stuff upon things heaped as high as the sloping stacks could reach until the shelves took over, carrying the architecture of swag into the cloistery. There was no rhyme to it, no unified genre of thing, just structural clutter. Reggie leaned back from the window with a curt, "Holy shit," and walked around to the other side of the building. The junkyard out behind appeared to go back quite a ways until it halted at the base of a small stony cliff, giving it a kind of natural back wall. The rusted siding fence, patched with old scrap iron and baling wire, seemed inarticulately cobbled together, but effective nonetheless. He walked back towards his car, but stopped. The sign in the window. It had said closed a minute before, he was sure of it, back at 6:30 and all that. Now it read, "Come in, we're open." It seemed that somebody must be home after all. It wouldn't hurt to have a peek. The door stuck a little, the way a car window does when months of neglect and algae glue the rubber flashing to the glass. The smell inside the building was cavernous, damp, much cooler than outside. An odor lingered. He remembered when a rat had died in the basement and nobody could find it. It was that smell again. Reggie sidled through the tight corridor at the front, careful not to disturb the precarious assemblage. His eyes moved over the horde in a delirious yaw. A glint from deeper inside the stack caught his attention. It was only a slight reflection from the menial amount of light that penetrated from the outside. He peered into the mess. Barely an arm's length down a small fissure in the heap, he spied a watch. It was a silver Casio, similar to the one his father wore. Very similar, in fact. The difference could have been chalked up to the obvious lack of a wrist to give it context. Instead, it sat limply on top of an antique suitcase just barely caught in a narrow, dusty sunbeam. He slowly reached his hand down the gap. It was an awkward job. The crevasse seemed to tighten as he squeezed, walking his fingers further as if to pull his arm from the end just to get another inch. The watch had seemed just close enough to reach, but now it felt like it was lingering just past the tips of his fingers. The rift was squeezing his arm and he could feel himself tipping, falling further into the stack. He adjusted his feet and half stumbled on an old magazine. His face fell just enough to catch his bare eye on the corner of something rough. He reeled back, retrieving his hand and holding his eye, which was now watering something fierce. He assured himself if there was no lasting damage but for the lingering trauma of getting poked in the eye. The watch was gone. In fact, the crevasse didn't even seem to be there anymore. The pile must have settled in all the hubbub. Through the distortion of his embattled eye, he made out a figure deeper in the gloom. The storekeeper? They were wearing a silly-looking wide hat and an ill-fitting long coat. They seemed to be considering Reggie from a distance. He couldn't make out a face. Reggie had just begun to question if this fellow was nothing more than a bad mannequin when they moved, or drifted, slightly closer. A voice like yellowed newsprint and old shoes wafted over to Reggie like mist in a graveyard.
"Please have a look around. The good stuff is in the back, please."
The figure gestured with a floppy sleeve down the aisle before shambling out of view, but it wasn't shambling. That's not exactly right. It was a peculiar gait, if it could be called a gait, like a child's plastic rake tumbling along a stony creek bed, a broken umbrella, a pillowcase full of Legos. Reggie gave his head a shake and kept moving down the tight corridor. He had made his way further into the insane junk shop. The smell was still there, a sour, sweet musk of dust settled so thick it resembled an oily fuzz. That and the dead thing. There was a clomp-clomp sound of approaching footsteps that, if Reggie had to be honest, sounded more like someone pretending to make footstep sounds with a pair of boots. The shopkeeper slid into view on the other side of the rack.
"Please, the good stuff is in the back. Please have a look around. The good stuff. Please."
His body was turned away, and Reggie still couldn't see the face, although he caught a brief glimpse of a pale ear that looked like it could have belonged on a Mr. Potato Head poking out from under the wide brim of the ridiculous hat. "Yeah, sure thing," Reggie said nervously, eyeing the figure. Once again the shopkeeper departed wordlessly in that same unsettling lurk. The sense of unease was slowly nudging its way past his sense of curiosity as he worked his way around, trying to regain his bearings. A windowless door sat slightly ajar ahead of him. This must be the scrapyard, he thought. The good stuff. Reggie didn't really care about a heap of rusted derelicts, but maybe he could round out his tour of the joint and find a gate or something at the far end. The scene outside was almost as strange as the shop. Cars, motorcycles, and buses were in various states of dismemberment, arranged and posed in haphazard, jagged stacks along the edges of the yard. some up on end, held there by rebar and metal beams like steel totems. There was one mostly open corridor down the center, leading back to the low cliff.
The good stuff.
Reggie wheeled around to see the shopkeeper standing off in the metal forest, gesturing like a scarecrow marionette to the back. To the good stuff. Then off again before Reggie could really settle on him. How much back was left to see, he thought to himself. Another mental note tickled at some instinctual nerve. He'd never seen this shopkeeper dead on. He was always a ways off. Always obscured. Always in the stuff. No opening or portature to the outside presented itself. Instead, what he found was a low, wide stone overhang, sprawling painted pictograms, weathered by vast eons of rain and wind overlaying eroded petroglyphs that would have been more ancient still before the artist ever laid pigment on the rock. Reggie expected antiques, a Balinese counterfeit of a Louis XIV's desk or a working Spanish cannon. But was this the good stuff? It was downright archaeological.
All in here.
Reggie spun around to the withering voice of his standoffish host.
Please, the good stuff.
It wasn't behind him. He ducked down slowly to peer beneath the overhang. Beyond the few scattered vestiges of eviscerated transportation, he could make out the low, wide mouth of the cave. So low that to enter he would have had to belly crawl.
Please, the good stuff.
The voice shot out of the crack. Reggie fell backwards.
Please, me.
Reggie's sense of up and down was suddenly and maddeningly ambiguous as his world reeled around him. The ground seemed to slope backwards, the cave waiting to swallow him like the throat of a snake. A realization struck him. Not totems. No, the cars weren't arranged like totems at all. They were teeth. My God, they were teeth. Even Reggie couldn't rationalize the sound he was making, part scream, part lunatic wail. The madness had fallen on him like a grand piano in a cartoon. It drove his mind into the ground so deep he couldn't move. He was being dragged by whatever horrors waited in the dark. They had a hold of his leg and were pulling him over the rusted debris. The thing that owned that natric voice had begun slavering. There were wet, gnashing sounds of obscene hunger. Reggie grabbed hold of the rusted skeleton of a partially buried car door, and by some fleeting burst of clarity and strength pulled it over himself in the low space, shoving it down hard on top of whatever held his leg. His stomach churned as he felt it make contact with something. He jammed it down again and again and again, and maybe he wounded it. Maybe it was just letting go to get a better grip. But it was the instant he needed. He scrambled to his feet and ran. He hit the back door of the shop so hard he worried that he had broken his collarbone. A bubbling scream of frustration as he remembered that the damn thing opened outward. His dexterity and reason had been tossed overboard in a sea of spiraling panic. His thumbs were lead, his brain was pudding. He spent the longest half-second of his young life trying to find the knob on the wrong side of the damn door before it flung open, hearing the grain split as he nearly ripped the hinges out. He was inside, scrambling between the listing stacks, the towers of things threatening to collapse in on him. Straight ahead, the shopkeeper secreted from the clutter, and Reggie aimed straight for the weird bastard. He plowed into what? He seemed to ride right through him. Not a man at all, just stuff, just so much stuff. Old children's toys, kitchen appliances, someone's blood-stained hat and jacket, and bones. Reggie saw them now. How could he not have seen them before? So many bones. They were filling the spaces between the clutter. Open suitcases, armoires, and umbrella stands spilling over with human bones. The place was a crypt, or maybe it was a dumping ground. He was tripping over them now, stumbling. He cut his foot on a jaw with a set of braces still on the teeth. He'd only realized that his shoe had come off in the struggle. If a sacrifice had to be made, he was happy to give up a shoe. He hit the front door same as the last, remembering full well that it opened inwards. But he wasn't going to stop. He angled his body, and in one sharp crunch of wood and glass smashed through, not caring which bones of his own paid the price. He hurtled from the front porch onto the gravel. His car was parked just across the road, being accosted by a tumbleweed. He jog-limped over to it, holding his left arm tight to his side, sure as shit that his collarbone was more pieces than it had been when he woke up. The key was still in the ignition. That was brilliant foresight, he thought to himself, and hit the accelerator. Outside the small desert cafe, Wayne Culligan was having a cigarette while he took out the garbage. He turned at the sound of a car's engine roaring up Bull Creek Road. An old blue Ford Bobcat skidded to a stop next to him in a plume of yellow dust. The window was down, and a haunted but familiar face looked over from the driver's seat. He put the cigarette in his mouth and crouched down to lean his elbows on the sill. "Never thought I'd see you again, kid." Reggie couldn't barely speak. He saw the waitress step outside and stare at the car with what could have been a scowl. "Find any more clues?" Reggie nodded. A concerned patron stepped outside to see what the fuss was. Wayne's mouth curled ever so slightly into a lupine smile. His voice was low. "You got a load of that old junk shop? Only building on the road, can't miss it." Reggie's eyes narrowed, a grim realization crawling up his spine like a spider. "You know, they got some good stuff in there. But you gotta go to the back. The good stuff is in the back." Reggie slammed his foot on the gas. Wayne stood up and took a step back as the car sped off, digging 2 ruts into the dry dirt. "What in Jesus' name?" The concerned patron, a fairly well-put-together middle-aged man in suspenders, stood there, his hands on his hips, shaking his head with a dumb, open-mouthed smile. "Local hooligans causing a ruckus," said Wayne without missing a beat. He walked past the man and held the door, courteously gesturing into the restaurant. "Arthur, was it? You like antiques, Arthur? Because there is this place you have got to see."